The aging field is really the only one that embraces the resilience concept in a way that there isn't a sole focus on disease or deficits, but an interest on healthier aging or successful aging from the perspective that there are different processes involved than when avoiding or preventing disease and morbidity.
From the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, this is Lessons in Lifespan Health, a podcast about the science and scientists improving how we live and age. I'm Professor George Shannon, Kevin Shue Chair in Gerontology. On today's episode, how Professor Thalida M. Arpawong is uncovering ways our genes and environments can impact our health as we age. M. Arpawong is a research assistant professor at the USC Leonard Davis School and the director of the Gerontology bioinformatics core. She's also the co-lead of the Genomic Translation Across Species core at the USC Buck Nathan Schock Center. She recently spoke to us about her research to better understand how our genes and environments influence how we respond to stress and adversity and impact how we age. So, Em, thanks for sharing this important information with us today. First of all, let's get down to basics. What exactly is bioinformatics? And can you explain for us the work that you're doing here at the USC Leonard Davis School?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to talk. So bioinformatics is a science subfield, but really just refers to a set of tools that we use to collect, analyze, and interpret findings from large volumes of biological data. We use tools like supercomputers, biostatistical models, computer programming, and specific types of software, while at the same time integrating biological concepts to guide how we use these tools. So the data we use, we call omics, data for short, includes primarily genomics, transcriptomics, epigenomics, proteomics, metabolomics. That's all the omics. Here in the School of Gerontology, Dean Cohen had a vision of creating a core to help support researchers in their labs that want to use omics data but may not have the background to do so. So relatedly, with the Genomic Translation Core, we also use bioinformatics to work with human data to collaborate with biologists. So these biologists work on model organisms for their research, like worms, mice, or yeast. And the biologists who have been granted pilot awards through the Nathan Schock Center, because they've made some important discoveries in their model organisms, we work with them to confirm what the relevance is of their findings for human aging processes. It's an exciting time because through this work together, we have the potential to use the expertise across different disciplines to answer some bigger questions that we haven't been able to previously with regard to cross-species effects of genomics and health.
That's great. The idea of collaboration across fields of interest is something that really resonates with me too. I think you partially answered this, but in addition to bioinformatics, what other research are you doing?
Well, that's a good question because I spend about half my time here at the Davis School in bioinformatics related work, and the other half on work that overall takes more of a social science approach. So my research is focused on unpacking how social factors, experiences of stress and adversity throughout different developmental stages in life, and genetic factors work together to influence emotional and cognitive health as we age. So we used to think that, genetics was much more deterministic, but we now know there are much more complex and interrelated processes occurring. So we found that social structures in which we can characterize groups, such as gender, race, and ethnicity, or social status, are very importantly related to how genes get expressed. So similarly, people's behaviors shape levels of gene regulation and expression, then have downstream effects on immune system health, the development of chronic diseases, for example, obesity, heart disease, depression, and even lifespan. So it's becoming more critical to include these key social factors in human research when we evaluate the effects of genomic data on health.
So, as a researcher doing these kinds of evaluations, how do you go about identifying the ways our genes and social environments combine to improve health as we age?
Well, that's another good question. I use approaches that generally fall into two branches of research. So one branch is referred to as statistical genetics, which uses measured DNA as variables in statistical models to test associations with traits. We can also use these variables as markers of specific genes. Or what has become more common practice in the last decade is to use genetic risk scores that are calculated from these DNA variables. And they essentially are calculated by including different markers across the genome for their cumulative risk for a trait. So the second approach that I apply comes from a branch of research called behavioral genetics, which uses inferred genes from twin and family data. So no blood or any DNA samples are needed. But an example of using measured genes is something that I've looked at recently, and that's the association between attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and cognitive functioning in later life. So heritability for ADHD in adults is about 30%, which doesn't mean that this is an individual's genetic risk for ADHD, but it means that 30% of the population variation in ADHD is attributed to genetic factors. So it's not a trifle amount. And because one of the hallmark characteristics of ADHD is cognitive differences, we tested whether or not this genetic risk score that is essentially present at birth was associated with cognitive functioning in older adulthood for people around the mean age of 69, with about 9,000 individuals. And this sample we took from the U.S. Health and Retirement Study, an extraordinary research resource. So initially, we found that the ADHD genetic risk score and cognitive functioning were directly and inversely related. But then when we tested the mediating role of level of educational attainment, we found that those with the greater genetic risk for ADHD tended to have lower educational attainment, which in turn predicted lower cognitive functioning. So the direct relationship was no longer evident. So that's an example of how we can combine genetic risk with a behavioral factor to interpret a genetic effect on something like cognition.
So you just said that you use twins data to help you understand how our genes and the environment can impact our health and behavior, I guess. Is that true?
Yes. Twin data is actually a very powerful way to conduct some of the human research because, as I mentioned, we don't have to take, biological samples from individuals, and we don't actually have to measure genes, nor do we have to measure the environmental factors. So instead, we can use modeling to estimate the degree that genetic, shared, and unique environmental factors contribute to a trait. So the logic is that we can calculate these because identical or monozygotic twins share 100% of their genes, whereas non-identical, also known as fraternal or dizygotic twins, on average share 50% of their genes. So because these twins come from the same families and thus share much of the same external environment, we can infer that if monozygotic twins have greater resemblance on a trait than DZ twins or dizygotic twins, there are underlying genetic influences at play. So that means if all the variants in a trait were attributable to genetics, we'd expect a correlation of 1 among these identical twins and a correlation of about half for the dizygotic twins. But that never really happens. So from the intra-pair correlations, we can calculate the degree of variance due to other non-genetic factors.
That's really interesting. I wonder what popped into my mind as you were talking was thinking about the young people who were virtually imprisoned at the border over the last few years and, wondering what kinds of effects environmental factors would have on their mental and physical health. Would that be something that you would be looking at, perhaps, if not now, in the future?
Yeah, so I think that relates to sort of the stress and adversity that individuals are facing at different time points in life? And that's a good question. I mean, very timely. I can draw from an example. We published a paper last year where we evaluated how having early childhood adversity and adulthood adversities affect the level of something like depressive symptoms when older. And early childhood adversities was measured as events occurring prior to the age of 18 and included things like physical abuse, parental substance abuse, parental death, maternal neglect, financial hardships. So some really impactful experiences. And adult adversities we measured, including events such as divorce, spousal loss, medical events like hospitalization or disease diagnoses, and financial events. So also some fairly large and impactful events. So I won't get too much into the details, but essentially we tested two competing but well-known hypotheses on how stress affects depression. And we took a life course approach. So this was data from 12,000 individuals that were followed up over 18 years between the ages of 50 and 93. And what we found were two main things. First, that there was essentially a dosage effect evidence. So that with each additional childhood adversity, there was an even greater risk for more later life depressive symptoms, even after the age of 50. And second, the hypothesis that was supported was called stress proliferation, which is essentially the idea that stress begets stress. So therefore, earlier life adversities are accompanied by more adulthood adversities, and that's how they work together to impact mental health later on.
I always start my classes in sociology by saying we are the sum of every moment of our lives. And indeed, some of the things you've just said kind of fit that thesis. And it's really, really interesting. One of the things that interests me a lot is the mind-body connection that we teach and promote a lot at this school. Can you explain the role that our mental or physiological health plays in healthy aging?
Yeah, so it's interesting because what you bring up is sometimes what we do in research is we study things at single time points, but really taking this sort of longitudinal lifespan perspective, as you're saying, the sum of its parts, is really where we need to be in terms of finding out how a lot of these things impact our lives and aging. So with the mind-body connection, there's a lot that we're finding out on this. And when we talk about experiences of adversity, for instance, the research supports what's called physical weathering, or that psychological stress causes a progressive physiological dysregulation. And so in that line of research, we don't just study, one single time point or one single event. It's kind of a panel of events that happen. And I should note that relationships between psychological stress and health are complicated in that individual reactions to stress vary by type and the context and the perception that is often shaped by culture. And so there's evidence that physical weathering is more pronounced among racial and ethnic minorities, and it's attributable to more frequent and persistent experiences of psychological stress. So when we think of psychological factors such as stress and adversity and socioeconomic hardships compared to other factors that affect aging, we're finding that they are more influential compared to genetic or biological factors. And in a recent study by Eileen Crimmins, she found that in particular with mortality and cognitive functioning, these factors explain 25 to 30% of the variance. So that's a significant amount, and often much more variance explained than we can detect for something like genetics.
I wondered, maybe, I hope it's not too far off track, but I find it very compelling that people can turn their lives around through meditation. And I was wondering if you think that there might be some way of demonstrating those effects just based on changes that occur in their mental, psychological health impacting aging.
Yeah. I think, interesting, there is a lot of research on the effects of meditation and mindfulness. I think that field has grown a lot. And actually, There's probably a good 20 years of research now on mindfulness and how things like mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques are actually effective at reducing the effects of stress. So it's interesting because, when we bring it back to how that affects or combines with genetics, we can think of how our social environment affects our genetic expression. We used to work under the assumption that the effect of genes was best studied at the level of a genotype or just what's encoded in our DNA sequences. But we're finding that there's so much more, and we need to measure how our DNA has structural changes that occur throughout life that are not in the code itself, but actually in our epigenome. So similar to using genetic risk scores, we can actually now calculate these epigenetic risk scores, and those tend to encapsulate things we've been exposed to or behaviors. So I'm not sure how much there is on mindfulness specifically or things like meditation, but there is research on how we react to stressful experiences, how that gets embedded into our epigenome, and we can quantify some of that using these epigenetic scores.
So presumably then relaxation, meditation, mindfulness can mediate levels of stress and affect, if not affect positively, reduce the negative effects of these stress factors.
I think so. One of the aspects of research that I am looking into, for which I'm grateful, I have a Hanson-Thorell Family Foundation award, but it's to look at long-term physical activity, the effects of long-term physical activity and how that affects our rate of epigenetic aging. So it's very similar along those lines.
You said that higher levels of education are connected to better aging outcomes. What do we know about nature versus nurture when we're looking at educational attainment?
Yeah, so education is important for aging because it's one of the most consistent measures to relate to almost all of the health outcomes that we look at, including cognitive, emotional, physical outcomes, financial outcomes, and mortality. So it's an important aspect. And what we found is that the heritability of educational attainment has been estimated to be around 40%, which then leaves 60% attributable to social influences or in the environment. But unpacking how those genetic factors and environmental factors sort of work together is important if we're looking from the perspective of how to promote more education, especially for those at high risk for some of the negative health outcomes. So one of the things we did is use a twin and family sample to test the relative importance of genetics, socioeconomic background of the family while in adolescence, and sex and gender on education. And we have a unique data set that is called the Project Talent Twin and Sibling Study. So we had family socioeconomic background measured in 1960 while people were in high school. And then we had follow-up for the same individuals through age 55 in 2014. So the findings are essentially what we can characterize as a gene by environment effect. Essentially, we found that genetic influences were twice as important for women, but from those who came from households with higher versus lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And in comparison, men showed the same genetic influences regardless of the level of their socioeconomic background. So together, these imply that higher socioeconomic backgrounds provided women with more opportunities to express their genetic potential for educational pursuits, whereas for women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, there were constraints that limited this potential. And this dynamic was not evident for men. So from this perspective, the genetic background that you're born with is not deterministic, but the expression is modified by the context.
So can you talk a little bit more about this idea of psychological resilience and the goals of your research in this area?
Yeah, so the topic of resilience is near and dear to my heart. And I appreciate that the aging field is really the only one that embraces the resilience concept in a way that there isn't a sole focus on disease or deficits, but an interest on healthier aging or successful aging from the perspective that there are different processes involved than when avoiding or preventing disease and morbidity. A lot of my work is focused on psychological resilience in different developmental stages of life, which means evaluating what contributes to people doing better than expected in the face of adversity or challenge. So not just having greater well-being or greater health, but having those states despite having been exposed to having to adapt to life insults and significant stress. And I think, as you're mentioning, this is exceptionally relevant today. So what I'm focusing on now is evaluating lifelong effects from adolescence through older adulthood for psychological resilience and how that affects biological aging. So one of my projects uses the Project Talent Twin and Sibling Study to answer the question of, does it matter when somebody is more physically active in earlier life or later life? Or do you need both to result in better cognitive and emotional health later on? And how much of the determination of those behaviors is nature versus nurture? For instance, how much is physical activity dictated by socioeconomic adversity when growing up or later life financial constraints? And then with regard to nature, one key finding is that there seems to be very little overlap between earlier and later life physical activities that's due to genetic factors. So I didn't expect to find this, but it's interesting because from a public health perspective, I'm interested in how physical activity is a protective factor against adversity to result in better health, and how the implications for findings from this work can inform how we design interventions to support how individuals adapt to stress throughout life.
That's fascinating. I'm doing a lot in the social work of aging, and all that you've been talking about in terms of the environmental factors, at least, suggests that coordinating the genetic inherited traits with improved social functioning can have a profound influence on better outcomes and healthier aging.
I agree. I think we need to integrate at this point the volumes of data that we have on multiple levels from the social factors, the genomics. And so it's a really interesting time in research to be able to do this.
I'm trying to develop an idea that involves life review, generativity, which is the idea of people giving back, and taking and then finding oneself in the present and attempting to project into the future.
There has been a lot of research on generativity and how that relates to a resilience concept called post-traumatic growth. So people who've been through really intense, kind of acute, stressful experiences have to reflect and rethink what their life means, what their purpose is, what their direction is in life, how they orient to people and relationships. And one of the things that is very related to gaining more post-traumatic growth is for older individuals is having this perception of greater generativity, because I think there's that relationship to purpose and meaning. And at the same time, when you're talking about looking forward, there's that whole concept of future orientation that also is related to higher levels of post-traumatic growth and adaptation post-acute stress and adversity. So I think these are all very intertwined and interesting.
Exactly. Tornstam came up with the idea of Gerontology in about 1992. And it was kind of a hot topic for about 10 years. And then everybody kind of dropped it because of the transcendent nature of, when we're talking science, how do we quantify it? How do we make it seem to be real instead of something ethereal and unreal? But I think the effects are real. And the work that you're doing and the ideas that you just expressed seem to convince me that I'm on the right track with that. It was really well said, the way you put it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's that whole field of psychoneuroimmunology that also bears some similar concepts, where there's a lot of researchers who were looking at things like mindfulness or flow. But the concept of mindfulness, I think, relates to transcendence. And there's a whole group of researchers that formed these collaborations with the Dalai Lama. And they were trying to conceptualize how to operationalize these aspects of meditation and other things that we find as beneficial, but we can't really study that clearly. And so there is a whole area that has emerged about the mind and the psyche and how we can use the mind and psyche to manipulate the effects on our immune systems and other aspects of our biology.
I mean, it can really have a transformative effect, I believe. And I think that studies that have taken place, even a few recent ones, suggest that that may be true and that we can try to carry it forward. I mean, I think the idea of merging these concepts, the hard science that you've been working on with the softer science, if you will, of, mind-body engagement. For example, looking at the influences of transcendental meditation and the influence of the Dalai Lama and some of the things that people do that seem impossible according to our rigid standards, right? So I'm really fascinated by it. And thank you very much for discussing it with us. I think it's really meaningful.
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity and bringing forth all these topics.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything about your work or your prospective work?
So, one thing is I'd really like to thank all the people who participate in surveys. So some who've taken part since high school in the case of the Project Talent Studies and allowed us to follow them up over 50 years later. And others who've answered questions every 2 years for almost 30 years. Some have given DNA and biological samples, but this method of tracking people's experiences, their natural histories, their biology, and how well these all come together has been absolutely invaluable to research across so many fields. And what we know about life course risk and protective factors for health as we age would not be where it is today without these folks, especially the diverse range of folks involved, so we can make research more relevant to addressing health needs for everyone. So if any of them are listening, a hearty, very grateful thank you.
Well, thank you, Em. That wraps up this lesson in lifespan health. Thanks to Professor M. Arpawong for her time and her expertise. And to all of you for choosing to listen. Join us next time for another lesson in lifespan health. And please subscribe to our podcast at lifespanhealth.usc.edu. Lessons in Lifespan Health is supported by the Ney Center for Healthspan Science and the Center for Lifespan Health.